The topic of my talk today is FDI, foreign direct investment, and the productivity growth. And this is actually a very broad topic. I'm going to talk about three particular aspects. The first one is the aggregate impact, how big the gains are from FDI, and the mechanism, that's my second part of the talk, even though I only have 15 minutes, and then the policy implications. And I would like to defer all the questions to Jim, because I learned everything that I'm going to talk about today from him. So I think he's responsible for all the credits and all the errors and the questions as well. Anyway, he was my advisor. So I would like to start with some stylized facts. Okay, these stylized facts are very well known, I think, to most of you in the audience. So the first stylized fact is that FDI has grown dramatically in the past decades. And that's true for both developed and developing countries. Okay, so as you can see, it doesn't matter how we divided the groups. And the second stylized fact is countries with greater inward FDI are on average growing faster in terms of productivity. But this, of course, represents only a correlation so far. We don't know anything about causality at this point. And the third stylized fact is most countries, actually the majority of countries, offer some sort of FDI promotion policies. And these policies can take a variety of forms, including reduced tax rates. You can see 55% of countries surveyed in this data set offer reduced tax rates. And 50% of countries offer tax holidays, and some countries offer grants, loans, subsidies, subsidized infrastructure services, and regulatory concessions. And this actually is not static. This trend of FDI promotion changes over time. And it's interesting. So you can see from 2000 to 2010-ish, the FDI promotion, the share of FDI promotion countries actually has gradually declined. But then after 2010, it has gone up back again to 84%. But in the meantime, the share of countries with FDI restrictions is also around, is not zero, right? As you can see, is 15 to 25%, and that has also been growing in the same period of time. Okay. So what about China? In 2014, China became the world's largest recipient of FDI. Okay, and in that growth, the key drivers are the FDI in services. That has become a major source of FDI growth to China. And between greenfield FDI and mergers and acquisitions have been growing faster than greenfield FDI. Okay. According to MOFCOM, just to get a sense about the importance of FDI in the Chinese aggregate economy, foreign invested enterprises account for over half of China's exports and imports, 30% of industry output, 22% of profits, but only employs about 10% of labor. Okay, so this tells us, these multinational companies in China are quite productive. They are able to produce a big share with only 10% of employment. However, this export and import activities of foreign multinationals in China have been declining in the last couple of years. And this is not just true for multinational companies, it's also true for domestic companies. And as you can see here, this just shows you, China, outperformed the US in becoming the largest recipient of FDI in 2014. And but we have to point out, this is very volatile, okay? The US experienced a divestment in 2014, which explains the large contraction of inward FDI, okay? And then if you look at the data from MOFCOM, from our China's own MOFCOM, you can see from the last column, the import and export activities by multinational companies in China have decreased in 2014 and 2015. Okay, and the investment in imported equipment declined even more. Okay, but in the meantime, China is also growing in its importance in outward FDI. So in 2014, China became the world's third largest investor country. In this outward FDI, greenfield FDI is still playing a dominant role, okay? And the MA activities are growing, but the MA activities, are actually concentrated in other emerging economies, okay? But what about investors' confidence and concerns? Okay, so according to the survey done by the UNCTAD, by the United Nations, China is considered as both a top investor country going forward and the top recipient country of FDI going forward. Okay, so investors remain highly interested and confident in China in terms of both making investments and receiving investments. But there are also a lot of concerns and issues going on. For example, rising labor costs. As we all know, labor costs is getting higher and more expensive in China, and that led many multinational firms to relocate, okay, from China to other developing countries like Vietnam. And there is also still a shortage of skilled labor despite the growth of skills. And there is a lot of domestic competition in both the final markets and the factor markets, especially the labor markets. Okay, and they also fear discriminatory treatments towards domestic firms. And they worry about the fragmented and incoherent investment policies. And on top of that, they are very concerned about the uncertainties of the regulations. Okay, not just the level of restrictions, but how frequent and how unpredictable the restrictions and policies could be. And they are worried about, not necessarily worried about, but they are constrained about the regionalism. So they are motivated, their location choices are significantly driven by the changing regionalism landscape that we are seeing, every day, okay? All right, so why do countries try so hard to attract FDI? What kind of potential impacts can we expect from FDI? So first of all, FDI is investment activity, so it's going to affect the capital flows, right? So many studies have looked at how FDI will affect the capital constraints, the capital markets in the domestic country. I'm just quoting some of the earlier studies by Anne Harrison and Margaret Macmillan. And in the labor market, obviously, we know foreign multinationals come in, they will create jobs, they might pay a wage premium as shown in Jim's work. And they might actually, create competition in the labor market, and that might, make it more difficult for domestic firms to attract labor. And the focus of this talk is productivity. They can affect productivity in many different ways. And this has been the focus of this substantial literature. Many people have looked at how FDI can affect the productivity of the domestic economies, okay? I'm gonna talk more about this later on. And then there are also studies looking at, FDI, is actually now functioning in the context of a network, right? So we can have, once you have multiple country models, you're gonna have this network of multinational production, okay? And you're gonna see all kinds of complex strategies of FDI, including, the actual platform FDI as Jim showed in his work in 2007. And then I take this opportunity to selfishly cite my own work. So I have done some work looking at, with Laura Alfaro, looking at how FDI can affect domestic economies' resistance to negative shocks during the financial crisis. It turns out it can play a positive role or negative role depending on the linkages shared between domestic economies and the foreign parent firms. Okay? And we also have done some work looking at agglomeration. We know multinational firms don't make their location choices independently. They take into account each other's locations when they make their entry decisions. So they tend to agglomerate together. And in this paper, we look at how they agglomerate and what kind of driving forces are behind the agglomeration decisions. But in today's talk, I'm going to focus on productivity gains from FDI, in particular the impact mechanisms and policies. And the first question we try to answer is, are there productivity gains from FDI? The micro evidence suggests there could be, but the macro evidence has this issue of causality. Are we really establishing the productivity gains from FDI, or are we simply capturing the correlation between productivity and FDI? And then the second question, which to me is more interesting, and that is, what are the mechanisms of productivity gains, if there are productivity gains? There are two channels that have been emphasized in the literature. The first one is multinationals are simply more productive than domestic firms, right? So of course the productivity can increase because multinationals are more productive. The second channel that is highlighted in the literature, and that is productivity spillover. Multinational firms are more productive, more technologically advanced, so they generate positive productivity spillovers to domestic firms. And that can happen through knowledge spillover, technology transfer, backward and forward production linkages. The evidence here is mixed. It depends on the linkages you explore. Some show positive evidence, some show insignificant productivity spillovers. But we would like to point out, at least my work would like to suggest two additional channels. One is the threat of competition could motivate domestic firms to innovate and improve their own productivity without any spillover effect. Establishing that is very difficult, and I would like to introduce my paper, but I'm not going to get into that with my students. Oh, wow. Okay, the second channel is selection and market reallocation. FDI can lead to tougher competition and market reallocation, and only allow the most productive domestic firms to survive. So the productivity will increase, not because of productivity spillover, but simply because of the selection and market reallocation. So how do we do that? So the way we do that, let me jump into the data. So we're going to use firm level data from Orbis, and that's going to give us a broad country coverage, about 1 million manufacturing firms in 30 countries. In the first stage, we're going to try to evaluate the aggregate impact from FDI. To do so, we're going to address the endogenous entry decision of multinational firms by using an instrument, but we're not going to have time for that. But what do we find? We find 100% increase in inward FDI will likely increase the average productivity of domestic firms by about 2%, 1.6%. Okay? But then we want to decompose that aggregate gain to two parts. Okay, so I'm not going to talk about the algebra behind it, but we are trying to decompose the aggregate productivity gains to the within firm productivity improvement. So the domestic firms can become more productive within themselves because of spillover, because of self-upgrading. But they can also, the aggregate productivity can also increase simply because we got rid of the least performing domestic firms. And it can also increase because we reallocated resources towards the more productive domestic firms. So there are these three components in this. So we're trying to decompose that, and how do we show that? So the first result I want to show you, let me jump to the figures. We want to show the within firm productivity gains do exist in our exercise, okay? Domestic firms across different levels of productivities do seem to see a productivity improvement, especially the lowest paying domestic firms. But in the meantime, we also have evidence for between firm selection. We find that the surviving firms after FDI entry are more productive than the exiting firms. Okay, so selection also plays a role. And then what about market reallocation? And we do find, okay, the revenue of surviving firms tend to contract after competition comes in, especially for the lowest productivity firms. So there is also evidence of market reallocation from the lowest productivity firms to the relatively high productivity firms. And that's also seen in the labor market. The employment contracts for domestic firms, especially for the least productive domestic firms. Okay? Now, how does this result, how can we put them together? We find that out of the 1.6% increase in productivity, the vast majority come from selection and market reallocation. Okay? So this is the main finding of this paper, suggesting selection and market reallocation play a very important role. Okay? And because, with the time constraint, let me show you this. We do that region by region, and we find that in East Asia, that's also true. Selection and market reallocation account for the majority of productivity gains from FDI. Okay. So I don't think I will have time to talk about the policies, right? I really hate that because I really want to talk about the policies a little bit. So let me just say 1 minute. Okay. All right, so I think the entry reforms are still very important in services. Okay, according to the World Bank's Invest Across Border database, China's restrictions on services are very much in place, okay, and are lower than the neighboring countries in the region and the world as a whole. And FDI promotion, I think there are still a lot of issues too. Shanghai's IPA, by the way, is highly ranked. The investment promotion agency is highly ranked in the world. But we can do more. We can do more in other cities' IPA offices. And the system is highly decentralized. This could lead to excessive red tape, redundancy, crowding out of other spending at the local municipality level, and the market distortions. And also, it's not clear how FDI promotion has worked in the past, whether they are actually effective, and how much FDI and the quality of FDI they have attracted. And we want to attract the right kind of FDI, and we need to have coordination between FDI and other domestic policies if we want to stimulate technology transfer and innovation. And furthermore, I think as we all know, there are a lot of BEAs being formed every year, and there are a lot of talks about the preferential trade agreements. And I want to point out, even though these agreements overall should promote FDI and trade, but they also generate concerns to the multinational firms because it's becoming increasingly complex and difficult for multinational firms to navigate these overlapping trade agreements. And it's not clear how these agreements will actually affect China's FDI in the future because, as we know, TPP does not include China, and China is trying to negotiate RCEP. So we need to understand how these trade agreements will likely affect our trade and FDI going forward. Sorry about the over time.
Thank you.